This animation explains requirements in the ADA and ABA standards for accessible parking and passenger loading zones located at facilities on sites. It does not address parking and passenger loading zones along public streets and sidewalks, which are the subject of new guidelines the U.S. Access Board is developing for public rights-of-way. Accessible parking is required for each parking lot and garage on a site. The required number of accessible spaces is based on the total number of spaces in a parking facility and is calculated separately for each lot or garage. A portion of accessible spaces must be designed to accommodate vans. Accessible spaces required for one parking facility can be located in another if doing so results in substantially equal or better access in terms of travel distances, parking fee, or user conveniences. Even when locating spaces to another facility, the number of accessible spaces still must be determined separately for each parking facility. Accessible spaces are to be located on the shortest accessible route to an accessible entrance. They must be dispersed among accessible entrances. In garages, accessible entrances are required to serve each direct pedestrian connection to a building. Where direct connections serve multiple levels of a garage, accessible spaces must be located on different levels so that they're dispersed among accessible entrances. Van accessible spaces, however, can be clustered on one level of a parking garage. In garages without direct pedestrian connections to a building, all accessible spaces must be located on the shortest accessible route to a pedestrian entrance of the garage. Accessible spaces must be at least 8 feet wide and marked to define the width. An access aisle of at least 5 feet wide and as long as the parking space is required next to the space. The access aisle must be marked. The marking method and color is not specified in the standards, but may be addressed by state or local regulations. The access aisle provides room to transfer to and from vehicles and must be flush with the parking space. Changes in level, other than slopes up to 1 to 48, are not permitted in either the access aisle or the parking space. Curb ramps cannot intrude into any portion of the access aisle or parking space. Two spaces can share one access aisle. Users pull in or back into spaces depending on which side of the access aisle is needed. Access aisles cannot overlap vehicular ways. At entrances with ramps, achieving the shortest accessible route typically requires locating accessible spaces near the entry point of ramps. Accessible routes must connect directly to access aisles. It is advisable to configure accessible routes so that users do not have to travel behind parking spaces, but this is not required by the standards. A landing at least 3 feet long is required at the top of curb ramps to facilitate maneuvering. Where space for curb ramps is limited, curb ramps can be configured so that they're parallel with sidewalks. Landings at the bottom of parallel curb ramps are to have a length of at least 4 feet, 5 feet preferred. At least one of every 6 accessible spaces, or a fraction of 6, must be sized for vans. Van spaces are at least 11 feet wide, 3 feet wider than regular accessible spaces, to provide room for vehicle ramps and lifts. This extra width can be added to the access aisle instead of the parking space, which results in an access aisle at least 8 feet wide, the same width as the parking space. If van spaces are angled, the access aisle is required to be on the passenger side. This is the side where vehicle ramps or lifts typically deploy. A vertical clearance of at least 98 inches is required for van spaces and vehicular routes serving them. This minimum clearance applies to the vehicular route from entrances to van spaces, the van spaces and access aisles, and the vehicular route to an exit. Accessible spaces must be labeled by the International Symbol of Accessibility. Signs can be installed on posts, suspended from ceilings, or fixed to walls. They're required to be at least 5 feet high, measured to the bottom edge, so that they remain visible when spaces are occupied. Those suspended above circulation paths must provide headroom clearance of at least 80 inches. The term van accessible is required on signs designating van spaces and can be provided on a separate sign or added to the main designation sign. This designation is meant to be informative, not restrictive. Those driving cars should keep these spaces free unless all regular accessible spaces are taken. The standards do not specify other features of signs, including color, or require other content on the sign. Signs for regular accessible spaces can contain only the international symbol of accessibility without any text. However, local jurisdictions may require specific verbiage. Designations located on the surface of parking spaces, even if required by state or local regulations, do not satisfy the standards and cannot substitute for signs that are at least 5 feet above the ground. Pay stations and other devices that serve accessible parking are subject to criteria for operable parts when fixed or built in. These requirements include clear floor space for a forward or side approach. Controls and other operable parts must be located within accessible reach ranges and be usable with one hand. They cannot involve tight grasping, pinching, twisting of the wrist, or more than 5 pounds of force to operate. Devices used from inside vehicles are not subject to these requirements, but should meet the specifications for operation so that they are easily usable. The standards also address access to passenger loading zones. Where they are provided, an accessible passenger loading zone is required within every continuous 100 linear feet of loading zone space or fraction thereof. In general, the requirements apply only if a passenger loading zone is provided, but the standards require a compliant passenger loading zone at several types of facilities. These include parking facilities with valet parking, mechanical access garages, and medical care and long-term care facilities where the period of stay may exceed 24 hours. Accessible passenger loading zones provide a vehicle pull-up space at least 8 feet wide and at least 20 feet long. An adjoining access aisle is required, and it must be marked at least 5 feet wide and as long as the space. The access aisle, like those at parking spaces, must be flush with the pull-up space and cannot overlap vehicular ways. No changes in level other than slopes of 1 to 48 maximum are allowed in either the pull-up space or the access aisle. A vertical clearance of at least 114 inches is required at the vehicle pull-up space and the access aisle and along vehicle routes connecting them to vehicle entrances and exits. Further guidance on accessible parking, passenger loading zones, and other requirements in the ADA and ABA standards is available from the U.S. Access Board. This animation was developed by the U.S. Access Board in cooperation with the federal agencies that issue the ADA and ABA standards.